As the night slowly wraps itself around the world, the lights go out one by one. And now you are setting off on a slow journey toward a very distant era in time. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, you can join these journeys every night by subscribing to Atlas of the Night. But for now, simply relax and let this story carry you away. Slow your breathing. Take a deep breath and let it go slowly. Tonight, on our journey through history, I will take you back thousands of years into the sands, the secrets, and the forgotten stories of ancient Egypt, to a time when the Nile flowed in silence, the pyramids stretched toward the sky, and the gods still walked among people. This is a story about a child, but not an ordinary child, a pharaoh. His name was Tutankhamun. The night moved slowly along the banks of the Nile. The wind gently scattered the sands, and deep inside the palace, a very young child lay sleeping. This child had not yet fully come to know the world, but fate would make him one of the most powerful people on earth. Tutankhamun was only 9 years old, and he was about to become the pharaoh of Egypt. Silence ruled the palace. Long corridors, columns adorned with gold, images of gods on the walls. Everything held a secret. At this hour of night, the palace seemed to be asleep. But in truth, it never truly slept. In every corner, a pair of watchful eyes. Behind every door, a pair of listening ears. The pharaoh's palace was a place that shone with magnificence by day, but filled with shadows by night. Little Tutankhamun's room was in the deepest part of the palace. With its high ceilings, gilded columns, and colorful murals, this room looked magnificent from the outside. But for a small child, it sometimes felt like a cage, because even in a pharaoh's room, everything was governed by rules. When to sleep, when to rise, in which direction to lie, with which words to begin which prayer. Everything had a meaning. Everything had a purpose. The sound of the Nile passed even through the palace walls. That slow, deep, and tranquil sound had been the pulse of these lands for thousands of years. For Egyptians, the Nile was not merely a river. It was life itself. Every year it flooded, watered the soil, gave life to the fields, and then receded. This cycle was the very existence of Egypt. And at the very center of that existence stood the pharaoh, the representative of the gods on earth. Little Tutankhamun had not yet fully grasped what this weight meant. But with each passing night, he felt the burden on his shoulders grow a little heavier. To truly understand Tutankhamun's story, we need to hear another story that came before his. An older, deeper story, one that changed the fate of Egypt. The story of a father. His name was Akhenaten. As the sun rose over ancient Egypt, golden light fell upon the walls of the temples. Priests were offering their prayers to Amun, Osiris, Isis, and hundreds of other gods. But that day, a young prince standing quietly at the entrance to the temple was different from everyone else. His eyes were questioning. He gazed at the statues, gold-plated faces, stone-carved bodies, and he whispered, "If they are truly gods, why don't they speak?" The question seemed simple, but its answer would shake an empire. Years passed, and that prince became pharaoh. But he didn't merely inherit the throne. He brought with him an idea, radical, dangerous, and completely outside anything known before. Akhenaten set all the old gods aside and declared, "There is only one God, Aten, the sun itself." That light shining in the sky, making life possible, visible, and tangible. To him, this was the true God. This decision shook Egypt's deep-rooted order. Temples were closed. Priests lost their power. The statues of the old gods were torn down. A belief held for hundreds of years was to be changed overnight. Hundreds of gods meant hundreds of temples. Hundreds of temples meant hundreds of priests. But one God meant one power. And that power now belonged to the pharaoh alone. Whispers began in Egypt. This is not right. The gods will be angered. The balance has been broken. Akhenaten founded a new city, in the middle of the desert, from nothing. This city, which he named Amarna, was the symbol of a new order, completely purged of the old gods, with wide boulevards open to sunlight. The temple walls had no roofs, for there would be no walls before the light of Aten. Everything was open. Everything was illuminated. Everything was turned toward the sun. But the past was not so easily erased. At night, prayers were still being offered at the old temples. Secretly, silently. And this silence was the silence before a storm. Throughout Akhenaten's reign, Egypt was simmering from within. Diplomatic relations with neighboring kingdoms weakened. The morale of the army declined, and the people began to no longer hide their longing for the old gods. In the end, Akhenaten simply disappeared. No farewell, no explanation, just a quiet vanishing. He left behind a shattered order, a restless people, and an unresolved crisis of faith. And in the midst of this void, there was a small child. His name was Tutankhamun. Before he could even fully understand what had happened, the fate of an empire had been loaded onto his shoulders. Before long, the day came for this child to be declared pharaoh. All of Egypt's eyes were on him. The temple was full. Priests, generals, palace officials, and high-ranking officers gathered in the same place. But there was no single expression on their faces. Respect, fear, or calculation. It was hard to tell. Little Tutankhamun stood before the throne. His body was so small inside that great gold-adorned throne. But in that moment, when the crown was placed on his head, the expression in the child's eyes had changed. Palace advisors, generals, priests, they all surrounded him. But none of them were truly helping him, because everyone had their own plan. The little pharaoh had to appear strong by day, but at night he was alone. One night, lying in his bed, gazing up at the ceiling, he sank into his thoughts. "Am I truly the pharaoh?" he whispered to himself. He was only a child, but everyone expected him to behave like a god. He was woken before sunrise each morning, prepared by servants, and spent most of his day in training. Priests told him of the order of the gods, which god represents what, which ritual is performed when, which words are spoken in which ceremonies. Generals spread out maps. Borders were discussed. How to stand at memorial ceremonies. How to receive envoys. How to sit in court. Everything was protocol. And Tutankhamun learned all of it with great attentiveness. Because in ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was not merely a ruler. He was the bridge between the gods and humanity. He was the son of Osiris, Horus himself. Even the sunrise each morning was believed to depend on the pharaoh reciting the correct prayers. This belief was one of the foundations that had held Egypt together for thousands of years. And now, this bridge rested on the shoulders of a 9-year-old child. As the nights passed, Tutankhamun began to change. He spoke less and observed more. Who looked at whom in what way? Which words were chosen? Which topics were greeted with silence? He was trying to decode the silent language of the palace, and slowly he was understanding. In this world, things were not as they appeared. The truth was most often hidden, not within words, but in the spaces between them. The two most important figures around Tutankhamun were two powerful men who were both his teachers and his greatest unknowns. And Horemheb. These two names would deeply shape the young pharaoh's life. But what either of them truly wanted would never be fully known. I was someone who knew every corner of the palace through years of experience. He chose his words carefully and generally remained in the background. Yet his influence was immense. His true power came not from weapons or armies. It came from knowledge. He knew who liked whom in the palace, who feared whom, which matter might arise at which moment. This knowledge was a power sharper than any sword. He was always courteous and respectful toward Tutankhamun, but courtesy could also become a mask. Horemheb was entirely different. He was a soldier, and he made you feel it not just through his title, but through his very presence. Discipline for him was not a habit, but a way of life. He rose before dawn, trained alongside his soldiers, and worked on battle plans through the night. He knew Egypt's borders, its enemies, and its alliances in minute detail. For him, power was not an abstract idea. It was something made concrete in the number of soldiers, the sharpness of weapons, and the loyalty of commanders. He was always respectful toward Tutankhamun, but beneath that respect, a silent and patient calculation was hidden. Tutankhamun grew up between these two powerful figures, learning from them, yet at the same time remaining in their shadow. As time passed, the question within him deepened. Were these men truly helping him, or were they waiting for the right moment to use him? This question began to take up more and more space in Tutankhamun's mind. He didn't know the answer yet, but he felt that one day he would learn it. There was an intuition inside him that he couldn't put into words, as if everything was slowly falling into place, but remained incomplete, like a painting not yet finished. One night, as he walked through one of the longest and most silent corridors of the palace, he stopped before a door. The corridor was almost completely dark. Only the flickering light of torches on the walls fell onto the stone floor, moving the shadows. The door was closed, but sounds were coming from inside. Whispers, low, cautious, but clear, as if those speaking did not want to be heard, yet could not entirely conceal what they were saying. Too young. Knows too much. This cannot go on like this. Tutankhamun held his breath and listened. His heart was beating faster than perhaps it ever had. Whether that rhythm in his chest came from fear or from beginning to understand the truth, even he could not tell. But he did not retreat. In that moment, something far stronger than fear lived within him. Awareness. For the first time, he understood that this palace was not as safe as it seemed. In this place where everyone smiled, he felt that behind every gaze there might be a different intention. Not everyone in this palace was a friend, and perhaps no one could truly be trusted. He listened a little longer, then silently withdrew. He slowed his steps, walking on as if he had heard nothing, seen nothing. But that silent transformation within him could no longer be undone. After that night, nothing would remain as it had been, because he was no longer merely a child being guided. He was someone who listened, observed, and was awakening to a truth growing inside him. Days passed. Life in the palace looked the same corridors, the same faces, the same ceremonies. But for Tutankhamun, nothing was as it had been before. He now watched every glance, every word, every silence more carefully. The priest's conversations, the general's looks, the advisor's whispers. He was piecing them all together, trying to understand. And over time, that question within him gave way to something else: resolve. He was no longer merely someone filled with doubt. He knew that something needed to change, and the one to initiate that change was himself. At last that day came. In the great hall of the palace, everyone gathered. Priests, generals, advisors, palace officials, all were present. Inside the hall, a heavy silence hung. No one spoke, but everyone was waiting. All eyes were directed toward a single point: the throne. Tutankhamun sat upon it. His small body nearly disappeared inside that grand gold-adorned throne. But this time was different. His eyes held no hesitation. He was silent. But this silence came not from indecision, but from certainty. He drew a slow breath. Everyone in the hall felt that moment. And then he spoke. His voice was neither loud nor weak, but clear enough for everyone to hear. "The old gods shall return." A slight stir moved through the hall. No one spoke, but everyone understood what had happened. The words hung in the air. Amun, Osiris, Isis. Names that had been silenced for years were returning to the heart of Egypt. The priest's eyes lit up. The moment they had long awaited had finally come. The lips of some began to move, silent prayers rising from within, and the people seemed to draw a deep breath all at once. An invisible burden had been lifted. The temples reopened. Their doors swung wide, and prayers that had echoed between stone walls began to rise toward the sky once more. This was not merely a decision. This was Egypt's return to itself, the remembering of what had been forgotten, the revival of what had been suppressed. Tutankhamun's name also changed alongside this transformation. The child once known as Tutankhaten was now Tutankhamun. This was not merely a change of name. It was a clear declaration, a choice, an announcement of which god's shadow he would stand beneath, of which world he would be a part of. He was no longer under the protection of Aten, but of Amun. This change legitimized him in the eyes of the priests and gave confidence to the people. Because in ancient Egypt, names were not merely words. Names were the essence of identity. They determined not who a person was, but what they belonged to. And sometimes, they became fate itself. The capital too received its share of this transformation. The city of Amarna, which Akhenaten had built in the middle of the desert, began to be slowly abandoned. That once sun-dedicated open city was sinking into silence. The administration moved back to Thebes, to the heart of ancient temples, deep-rooted traditions, and old belief. This was not merely a geographical change. It was the abandonment of a thought, the erasure of a belief. Amarna's walls were dismantled, its statues shattered and buried beneath the sands, as if that city had never existed, as if Akhenaten's revolution had been nothing more than a bad dream. The temples were repaired, their doors reopened. Karnak came alive again. Voices rose in its courtyards. Prayers echoed between its columns. The priests resumed their ancient ceremonies. The people could at last speak aloud the prayers they had suppressed for years. Egypt began to breathe again, as if drawing a long-held breath. And at the very center of this great transformation stood a child not yet 10 years old. A small body, yet the bearer of a monumental decision. Yet behind this transformation, An unresolved tension still existed within the palace. The temples had reopened, yes, but the power struggles had not ended. On the contrary, they had merely changed shape. The old balances had been shattered, and new ones were beginning to be built in their place. The priests were reclaiming their former power, while the invisible lines within the palace were being redrawn. Everyone was trying to find their footing once more. Who would grow stronger? Who would remain in the shadows? And most importantly, who would be the true master of the palace? These questions circulated not just in a few minds, but in nearly everyone's. Yet no one had found a clear answer yet. Everything appeared calm on the surface, but beneath that calm, a constantly shifting tension moved. And Tutankhamun was at the very center of this turmoil, not merely as someone searching for answers, but as the person who stood at the center of those answers. Because every decision made, every change enacted, happened in his name. How much of these decisions were truly his, and how much were guided by others, was becoming ever harder to discern. And yet his life was not made up solely of these power games. Beyond the palace walls, there was a world, or at least there was supposed to be. The closest witness to that world was someone who shared his fate, his wife, Tutankhamun. This marriage was part of royal tradition, a bond established for the continuation of the dynasty. Tutankhamun too was of royal blood, and so this union was not merely two people coming together, but also the preservation of a dynasty's future. Yet was this bond only a duty? Or did it become, over time, something deeper, quieter, beyond words? We cannot say for certain, but there are some bonds that are never spoken of, never proclaimed, only felt. And perhaps theirs was just such a bond. Tutankhamun had not lived an easy life either. Her childhood had not passed like that of an ordinary child. The sweeping changes her father Akhenaten had set in motion had shaken her world to its foundations. She had grown up in the sun cult of Aten, in a world where a single god was accepted as absolute truth. But then, she witnessed this world slowly crumbling. She saw that beliefs once considered beyond question could be abandoned in an instant. She watched temples close and then reopen, names change, and then be taken back. People forced to alter even what they believed. For a child, this was not simply change. It was a fracture. She had felt the uncertainty, the insecurity, and the constantly shifting power dynamics inside the palace, just as deeply as Tutankhamun. And perhaps, precisely for this reason, an understanding grew between them that needed no words. Two people who understood each other without speaking, who shared the same pressure, the same loneliness, and the same silent fears. They grew up together, within the same walls, beneath the same gazes, carrying the same burden. From the outside, it appeared they were living golden lives, surrounded by grandeur, wealth, and power. But the palace was not as free a place as it seemed. On the contrary, it was the most watched place, a world where every move was tracked, every word weighed, every glance carried meaning. A wrong look, a wrong word, and everything could change in an instant. For this reason, silence was most often safer than speech. For Tutankhamun, the palace was both a home and a prison surrounded by invisible walls. And the same was true for Tutankhamun. Though they appeared to hold power, in truth, they did not have full control over their own lives. Within this silence, the most real and most fragile traces of their lives surfaced centuries later in their tomb. Among the gold, the jewels, and the dazzling wealth, something no one had expected was found. 2 small coffins, silent, modest, yet the weight of the meaning they carried was beyond description. These coffins belonged to the children Tutankhamun and Ankhesenamun had lost before birth, or in very early infancy. This detail carries their story far beyond palace intrigues, political games, and religious transformations, because at that point, they were no longer a pharaoh and a queen. They were 2 people who knew loss, 2 people who knew what grief meant, yet were compelled to conceal even that grief from watching eyes. Because in the palace, weakness was never shown, and some sorrows were lived most silently, and that silence most often carried the heaviest burdens. The burden Tutankhamun carried did not belong to his heart alone. His body too bore the marks of that weight. Modern research shows he struggled with a range of health problems, issues with his bone structure, deformities in his legs, and conditions that made walking difficult. When considered alongside the hundreds of walking sticks found in his tomb, this picture becomes even clearer. These sticks were not merely objects. Each one was a silent piece of evidence showing just how difficult every step he took truly was. Every step was an effort, every movement an invisible struggle. And yet, despite all of this, he was always required to appear before his people as a powerful pharaoh. Because the pharaoh was not merely a human being, he was a symbol. On the murals, he is shown hunting, driving a war chariot, vanquishing his enemies, an image perfect, powerful, and invincible. Reality was hidden behind these images, because the pharaoh's image most often took precedence over the truth, and sometimes those who appear the strongest are those who carry the heaviest burdens in the most silent of ways. Despite all this, during Tutankhamun's brief reign, Egypt experienced a remarkable period of recovery. But this healing was far deeper than it appeared on the surface. This was not merely the reopening of temples or the changing of a name. This was an effort to repair the fractures left behind by an era. Akhenaten's radical changes had shaken not only the belief system, but the foundational structures of the state itself. It was necessary to revive institutions that had been neglected for years, to restore the crumbling order, and most importantly, to regain the trust of the people. This was a process that required patience, and a path along which every step needed to be taken with care. The great restoration work begun at the Temple of Karnak was one of the most tangible examples of this rebirth. Broken down walls were rebuilt. Torn down statues were either returned to their places or reconstructed. Not just stones, but meanings too were being rebuilt. The training of priests was reorganized. Ceremonies resumed their old rhythm. Prayers that had been silent for years rose again. And then, one of Egypt's most important traditions returned: the Opet festival. This festival was not merely a celebration. It was a sacred ritual that renewed the pharaoh's bond with Amun and allowed the people to reconnect with their gods and their ruler. Days of ceremonies, music, dance, and abundance. This was not just a festivity, but also a moment of healing. The people did not simply celebrate at such times. They also believed again. Careful steps were also taken in foreign policy. The diplomatic relations that had weakened during Akhenaten's era were being re-established. Egypt's ties with its former allies began to be refreshed. Relations with the Hittite kingdom, which had taken a tense turn, could not be fully resolved. But at least diplomatic channels were kept open. Even this was significant in itself. because an environment without war was necessary for reconstruction. To the south, Egypt's dominance over Nubia was strengthened, and the borders made more secure. All of these developments, viewed from the outside, appeared to be the signs of a strong government. But in reality, the question of who stood behind this process remained unanswered, because such sweeping changes were not simple enough for a young pharaoh to shoulder alone. Yet even so, all of these steps were being taken in his name. Egypt was regaining its footing under his name. And through this process, Tutankhamun too was changing. Where once he had been a guided child, he was gradually becoming someone who listened, observed, and sought to understand. He was no longer someone who simply accepted what was told to him. He was asking questions, weighing his thoughts, and increasingly beginning to shape his own decisions. This change was slow, but it could be felt. And perhaps it was precisely this that was most dangerous. Because a pharaoh who could be controlled was an advantage for many people. But a pharaoh who had begun to form his own will could shift the balance. And a shift in balance meant risk for some. In the dark corners of the palace, this change may have been noticed. Whispers may have started again. Gazes may have changed. Silences may have grown longer. Because power is not merely acquired, it is guarded. And sometimes, the greatest threat comes not from outside, but from within. How aware Tutankhamun was of this is unknown. But one thing was certain. An invisible tension was growing again within the palace, and this tension seemed like a harbinger of an end not yet revealed. Just as everything seemed to be settling into place, as order had been restored, the gods had returned, the temples had reopened, Tutankhamun's life came to an unexpected end, not in the middle of a great battle, nor at the end of years of illness. Suddenly, silently, at only around 18 or 19 years of age, a young pharaoh lost his life, leaving behind countless questions. This death, even in that era, was not something that could be easily explained, because order had visibly been restored, and the pharaoh, at least from the outside, appeared to be carrying out his duties. So such an abrupt end was not only a loss, it was also an unknown. And that unknown has preserved itself through the centuries. Thousands of years later, modern science began to search for the truth within that silence. X-rays, tomography scans, and DNA analyses performed on Tutankhamun's mummy were new tools seeking to illuminate the darkness of the past. The findings obtained, rather than reducing the questions, multiplied them further. There was a severe fracture in his leg, believed to have occurred shortly before his death. This fracture had not healed. This suggested that death may have occurred a short time after this injury. Some researchers proposed that the young pharaoh had been involved in a chariot accident, and that the wound resulting from this accident had become infected, leading to his death. This scenario was both plausible and tragic. For a body already struggling physically, such a blow could well have been fatal. But this was not the only possibility. Another theory pointed to an invisible enemy: disease. DNA analyses revealed traces of malaria parasites in Tutankhamun's body. Moreover, this may not have been a single infection. It may have been a condition experienced on multiple occasions. Combined with a weakened immune system, genetic disorders, and physical fragility, a severe bout of malaria may well have produced fatal consequences. This theory described a collapse that came silently from within, an end that advanced slowly, invisibly, unnoticed from without. And then, the possibility most discussed, most wondered about: assassination. For many years, some researchers, citing damage to the skull, argued that Tutankhamun may have been murdered. Given the power struggles within the palace, this possibility could not be entirely dismissed. Because this death was not merely the end of a life, it was also the beginning of a void. And this void, for some, meant opportunity. Moreover, the person who ascended the throne after his death was someone who had been by his side for years, close to the center of power. This deepened suspicions further. Was this merely a coincidence? Or was this a long-awaited end? However, more detailed investigations conducted subsequently showed that the damage to the skull had most likely occurred after death. This weakened the assassination theory, but did not eliminate it entirely, because some questions live longer than their answers. The truth is, Tutankhamun's death has still not been definitively explained. Perhaps an accident, perhaps an illness, or perhaps truly a planned end. No one knows this with certainty. But one thing is certain. He was very young, and his story ended just as it was beginning to take shape. Just as he had begun to understand his own power. Just as he had begun to make his own decisions. In the palace, this death created not only grief, but also a silent yet swift movement. On the surface, everything was orderly. Ceremonies were held. Rituals were performed. The pharaoh was seen off. Everything was as it should be, at least from the outside. But beneath this order, something very different was occurring. Quietly, without drawing attention, yet resolutely advancing. A change, because voids in the palace never remained empty for long. Power did not wait, and those who were already ready to fill this void were there. Those who had long been watching for the right moment, ready to act when it came. And now, that moment had arrived. After Tutankhamun's death, time in Egypt seemed to slow for an instant. The sudden loss of a young pharaoh created not only grief, but also uncertainty. In the palace, everyone was thinking about what the next step would be. And before long, the answer came. The person who ascended the throne was a name that had long been present inside the palace. Old, experienced, one who had over the years quietly positioned himself at the center of power. For years he had appeared as an advisor, remaining in the background. But now, he was at the center of the stage. He was no longer merely someone who pointed the way. He was Pharaoh himself. But Ai's reign did not last long. After him, another name emerged, who would shape Egypt's fate more forcefully: Horemheb. This man of military background wanted to establish order. But his understanding of order was not limited merely to building the future. He also wanted to bring the past under control. And the most effective way to do this was to rewrite it. Just as Akhenaten's revolution had been erased, Tutankhamun's era too began to be slowly wiped away. His statues were smashed. His name was chiseled away from inscriptions. The traces on his monuments were altered. His name was removed from the official lists of pharaohs, as if he had never existed. In ancient Egypt, erasing a pharaoh's name was not merely a historical decision. It was an attack on existence itself. Because for Egyptians, a person's name was an extension of their life. As long as a name was spoken, that person continued to exist in some way. But when a name was erased, that person was severed not only from this world, but from the next as well. This was a punishment heavier than death. And this was precisely what happened to Tutankhamun. They sought to remove him not only from the throne, but from memory itself. In this process, Ankhesenamun was left completely alone, unprotected, amid the chaos of the palace, the power struggles, and the sudden changes. Some historians believe she was gripped by profound fear during this period, and this fear drove her to take a step rarely seen in history. According to some sources, Ankhesenamun sent a letter to the Hittite king. And in that letter, she asked for a prince to marry her. This was an extraordinarily unusual situation for ancient Egypt. A queen requesting a husband from outside her own dynasty showed just how deep the insecurity within the palace had become. This was not merely a request for marriage. It was a search for escape. But this plan was never realized. The prince who was sent was killed on the road before reaching Egypt. Was this a coincidence or a deliberate act of obstruction? No one knows for certain. But one thing is clear: this attempt failed, and Ankhesenamun silently vanished from the historical stage from this point onward. What became of her, where she went, what kind of end she met, is unknown. Just like Tutankhamun himself, she too was lost in silence. And then, time passed. For centuries, empires rose, fell, were rebuilt. Egypt fell under the dominion of foreign powers, then changed hands. Languages changed, beliefs transformed, gods were forgotten, and the sands began to slowly cover everything. Temples, cities, names, and stories. Tutankhamun's name nearly vanished entirely. But not everything was lost. Because that small tomb was different from the others, overlooked, unlooted, and left exactly as it was in its depths. It waited like a secret no one had touched for centuries. The sands that fell upon it did not merely conceal it, they also protected it. Time had erased so many things: names, cities, memories, even the traces of kings once thought to have ruled the world. But it could not erase him. It had merely made him wait for the right moment. For centuries, unnoticed, silently, patiently. And that moment, at last, came. At the start of the 20th century, most archaeologists working in Egypt believed there was nothing important left to discover. In the Valley of the Kings, almost all the significant tombs had been found, examined, or long since looted. The earth seemed to have largely yielded its secrets. But there was one person who did not accept this idea: the British archaeologist Howard Carter. In his view, something was still missing, something everyone had looked at, but no one had truly seen. And at the center of that missing piece stood a single name: Tutankhamun. Carter's relationship with Egypt had begun at a very young age. He had studied art, he drew, but he had found his true passion at excavation sites, in the midst of the desert, in the past hidden within stones and sands. Over the years, he gained experience, learned the region, learned patience, and above all, learned not to give up. A British aristocrat named Lord Carnarvon was financing his work. But this support had not been easily earned. Years of excavations, fruitless searches, and repeated failures brought Carnarvon to the point of giving up time and again. He had come to believe this endeavor had no end. But Carter continued each time. Because for him, this was not merely a dig. It was the pursuit of something he knew to be true. And then, in November 1922, everything changed. During a routine excavation in the Valley of the Kings, one of the workers struck a hard surface beneath the sand. At first it seemed unremarkable, but when they cleared it away, a stone step appeared. Then another. Then yet another. The steps extended downward. This was no longer an ordinary find. Carter understood in that moment that they were facing something different. He immediately halted the excavation and sent word to Carnarvon. This could be an important discovery. Come at once. A few weeks later, Carnarvon arrived in Egypt, and the two men began to descend together down those steps. Each step brought them a little closer to the past. At the bottom of the steps was a sealed door. The seals were unbroken. This meant the tomb had not been opened for thousands of years. In the world of archaeology, this was a nearly impossible situation. Carter carefully made a small hole in the door. He extended the candle in his hand through it. The air inside made the flame flicker. Shadows moved, and in that moment time seemed to slow. Carter looked inside. A long silence followed. Carnarvon could not conceal his excitement and asked, "Can you see anything?" Carter's answer passed into history. Yes, wonderful things. In that moment, it was not merely a tomb that had been opened. A time halted thousands of years ago had begun to flow again. Inside was an almost entirely intact world. Gold-plated war chariots, the pharaoh's throne, intricately crafted statues, jewelry boxes, wine jars, everyday baskets, and countless other objects stood exactly where they had been placed, as if someone would return at any moment and continue from where they had left off. The gold surfaces gleaming in the darkness seemed to come alive in the candlelight. Carter and his team worked for months. Every object was individually recorded, photographed, carefully moved, and preserved. This was not merely a discovery. It was also a great responsibility, because every object carried a story from the past. In total, more than 5,000 objects were found. This was one of the greatest and best preserved treasures in the history of archaeology. And finally, the innermost chamber of the tomb was reached. Inside were 4 nested coffins, layer upon layer, carefully prepared, placed there for protection. And within these coffins lay a body that had been waiting for thousands of years. Tutankhamun. And upon him was what is perhaps one of the most extraordinary objects in all of human history, his golden mask. It was silent, but even thousands of years later, it still spoke. Crafted from approximately 11 kilograms of pure gold, this piece was not merely a reflection of wealth, but also a tangible embodiment of ancient Egypt's understanding of death and the afterlife. It was framed with lapis lazuli. The serpent and vulture figures symbolized the pharaoh's dominion over both Lower and Upper Egypt. Its eyes were fashioned from quartz and obsidian, so when you looked at the mask, you felt it looking back at you. This was not merely a work of art. It was the face the pharaoh would wear in the world after death, an identity prepared for eternity. But at the same time, it was an illusion, because the reality lying beneath the gold was very different from the perfect figure the mask presented. When scientific work reconstructed Tutankhamun's face, the image that emerged showed the person behind this magnificence, a young man with delicate features, slightly protruding teeth, and a fine, fragile bone structure. Behind the perfect, serene expression of the golden mask was a human being who struggled with the weight of his own body. Fragile, yet compelled to resist. The other objects found in the tomb completed this reality. Game boards were found, showing that he was not only a pharaoh, but also a young person who played games in his free time. There were bows and arrows, perhaps tools he wanted to use, but could not always. Numerous garments, collections of sandals, traces of everyday life, and among the most striking, more than 130 walking sticks. These sticks were not merely symbolic. Most had truly been used. Their wood was worn, their handles abraded. Each one was a silent record of the difficulty he experienced while walking. But perhaps the most poignant finds in the tomb were its smallest. 2 little coffins. Inside, 2 small mummies wrapped with extraordinary care. Examinations revealed that one was approximately 5 to 6 months old, and the other around 9 months. They were the children of Tutankhamun and Ankhesenamun. 2 lives that never made it into the world, or lived only the briefest of moments before disappearing. And the pharaoh had taken them with him on his final journey. This was not merely a detail. Beyond the gold, the power, and the magnificence, it was evidence of a deep and silent grief, carried in the heart of a human being. But what emerged with the opening of the tomb was not only the traces of the past, it was also the beginning of a new story. There was something that began to be talked about shortly after the tomb was opened: the curse. Lord Carnarvon, who had financed the excavation, unexpectedly lost his life just a few months after the tomb was opened. According to official records, this was an infection resulting from a mosquito bite. But the timing of the event immediately opened another door in people's minds. Because sometimes reality is not powerful enough on its own, and people fill the gaps with stories. Rumors spread quickly. Some claimed there was a warning inscription at the entrance to the tomb: "Death shall come on swift wings for him who disturbs the peace of the pharaoh." The existence of such an inscription was never proven, but that mattered little, because the story had already come to life. It spread from ear to ear, was picked up by newspapers, grew, and changed shape. Over time, the event was not limited to a single death. The subsequent passing of several people connected to the excavation at different times further reinforced the curse rumors. The newspapers of the era narrated these stories in dramatic language, linking each death to the pharaoh's vengeance, making every detail a little darker and more mysterious. And so, Tutankhamun, thousands of years after his death, continued to live once more in a place between fear and wonder. However, scientists tried to look beyond this narrative. In their view, the explanation was simpler, but perhaps more realistic. The closed environment of tombs may have provided ideal conditions for the development of bacteria and fungal spores over thousands of years. This environment could pose serious health risks for those entering the tomb for the first time. Moreover, the medical capabilities of that era were extremely limited. Infections that today might seem minor could prove fatal at that time. These explanations were logical, scientifically consistent. But what captured people's interest was not always facts. The unknown was more powerful. Mystery was more alluring. And the curse story offered precisely that. In fact, when examined more closely, the facts are far more ordinary. The vast majority of the dozens of people who participated in the excavation went on to live for many more years. Carter himself lived for approximately 17 years after opening the tomb. If there had truly been a curse, Carter should have been the first one it affected, but it did not. Yet this did not stop the story, because a curse did not need to be true. It only needed to be a narrative. And this narrative added one final layer to Tutankhamun's already captivating story: an invisible, inexplicable, enduring mystery. As time went on, this story became not merely the story of a discovery, but of a transformation, of how a forgotten name became immortal. Today, Tutankhamun is one of the first names that comes to mind when ancient Egypt is mentioned. In museums, entire halls are devoted to his name. From all corners of the world, people have waited and still wait for hours in line to see that golden mask. His story has been carried into films, novels, documentaries, and stages. A name once sought to be erased from history now persists like a light that never quite fades. But the most striking aspect of this story is the irony it carries. Because while Tutankhamun was alive, he was not regarded as a great pharaoh. He ruled for a brief period, won no great wars, built no colossal monuments. Those who came after him deliberately tried to erase him from history. His name was chiseled away. His memory was to be destroyed. But for precisely that reason, his tomb, unlike those of other pharaohs, remained untouched. And this circumstance, which seemed like coincidence, made him the pharaoh about whom we know the most today. Great pharaohs had magnificent tombs built, but those tombs had been looted over time. Tutankhamun's smaller, overlooked tomb protected him for thousands of years. This made his story far more vivid and tangible than all the others. Ramesses II won great battles, commissioned colossal temples, and lived a long life. But most of what we know about him comes from inscriptions carved in stone and crumbled structures. Tutankhamun, on the other hand, ruled for only about a decade. Yet we can reach into the details of his daily life. We know which sandals he wore, which games he played, how he walked, which diseases he battled. These details lift him out of legend and transform him into a real human being. And perhaps precisely for that reason, people feel such a powerful connection with him. Because he represents not power, but fragility. Not empire, but what it is to be human. Not great victories, but silent struggles. And this makes him recognizable, thousands of years later, because fragility is independent of time, and everyone who carries that feeling finds a piece of themselves in Tutankhamun's story. That is why his story does not belong only to the past. It continues still. Every time it is told, every time it is remembered, it begins to live again. In ancient Egypt, people did not believe death was an end. For them, death was the beginning of another journey. That is why tombs were not merely places of burial, but gateways to a new life. Everything the deceased might need on this journey was placed beside them. Food, clothing, jewels, and beloved objects. Every object found in Tutankhamun's tomb had been prepared so that he would not be alone on this journey. And perhaps that is why the tomb is so extraordinary, because it is not merely a room filled with gold and precious stones. It is a frozen moment in time, carrying the traces of a life. Every object left untouched brings a small fragment of his life to the present day. The game board still sits there, as if he might return at any moment and continue. The sticks wait in the corner, the wine jars remain sealed, and the two small coffins continue still to carry the trace of a silent grief. Tutankhamun's story is in truth a story about time itself, about what it conceals, what it erases, and what it sometimes chooses to preserve. Some people live long, leave great marks, and yet are forgotten with time. Some live briefly, but their stories go on being told for centuries. Tutankhamun is one of them. There were those who sought to erase him. His name was chiseled away. His memory was to be destroyed. But time does not rule over all things. Sometimes a small tomb hidden beneath the sands surpasses all armies and all commands. And there, in the darkness, in the silence, beneath the weight of centuries, a name goes on living. The night has now fully settled. The Nile flows silently, just as it did thousands of years ago. The wind softly scatters the sands, and this story continues to echo within that silence. Tutankhamun's life was brief. He received the crown at 9, closed his eyes at 19, and in that short span tried to restore the balance of an empire, observed those around him, learned, carried his own fragility, while leaving behind an unchanging expression of strength on his face. He was a pharaoh, but he was also only a young person, and perhaps precisely for that reason, he still feels so familiar thousands of years later, because to be human is something beyond time. And now, as we reach the end of this journey, you can let go a little more. Slow your breathing, release the thoughts in your mind, and let this silence gently draw you inward. Because some stories are told and end, but some simply go on echoing, and the night, slowly, surrenders you to its own silence. And if you are still awake, perhaps you do not want this journey to end here. If this story was good for you, don't forget to like and subscribe to the Atlas of the Night channel, because here, every night, new stories are waiting to take you to another time, another world. And I'm curious, where would you like to go on the next journey? To the mysterious city of Petra, carved into the cliffs, to the palaces of Andalusia's golden age, or to the splendor of the ancient Roman Empire, or perhaps somewhere entirely different? Share it with me, because the next journey could be your choice. And now, we are truly reaching the end of this journey. The silence of the night continues to envelop you. Thoughts are slowing, your breath is growing calm, and this story, leaving a gentle trace in your mind, drifts away. There is nowhere you need to go now. Just rest, just let go, and let sleep slowly carry you away. Good night, and peaceful dreams.